delighted that you've joined us today. But before we go into the challenges, do you want to give a quick intro to yourself and to Broadstones and what you guys do?
Sure thing. Yeah, no problems, G. So my name's Mark Baginski. I'm the Chief Operation Officer at Broadstones Group. I'd describe us as a boutique consultancy firm. We've got a fairly long legacy in financial services, and actually most of the team come from deep within FS, either as a supplier to those organisations or client side, and in consultancy where we're close to the client, advising them on getting the best use of technology to really drive innovation and generate revenue in their businesses. A little bit about Broadstones Group. So whilst we're quite small, we've got enjoy quite a broad client list, and we are a supplier to the FCA. We're a supplier to His Majesty's Government, Crown Commercial Services, and we were fortunate enough to be appointed as one of 23 companies in the UK on the NHS and the public sector automation framework. So we're quite blessed with having quite a diverse supply chain. And for the last 3 years in a row, we've been fortunate enough to win the Financial Times Management Consultants of the Year Award as voted for by our clients. So hopefully we can have a useful conversation around some of the challenges in industry and FS.
Yeah.
And go from there.
Yeah, fantastic. And obviously you're a value partner of Aiimi too. So we'll get straight into it. So let's start with quite a high level, quite a broad question. So what are the biggest challenges you're seeing in financial services at this moment in time?
Sure. So, one of the things that we've had lots of similar conversations with industry colleagues recently. If you look at what you and I are looking for as a consumer of services, okay, technology is changing all the time. We are looking to consume services that have interesting technology in them, that give us an edge, that give us a better product or service. And financial services companies, regardless of what they're providing, are trying to make use of that technology to attract customer base, to retain customer base. Yeah. That pace of that change is very, very rapid. Companies are trying to incorporate that into products and services and rushing to do so to stay relevant. It's just as easy to change a bank today as it is to change your energy supplier, right?
Yeah.
So that pace of change, the pace of change adoption is creating a challenge within financial services and other similar industries. And we as consumers are driving that.
Yeah.
But if you look at what that means for the regulator needs to ensure the stability of the financial system. So they have to keep pace with the rate of change. They need to put controls around that. And that's challenging, right? If you look at the pace of what's been happening over the last few years, and you think about the pace of regulation and where that's going in terms of updates and new items over the last few years, it's quite a rapid pace of change that the regulator is trying to get on top of, that financial services companies are needing to comply with.
Yeah, and is that kind of domestic regulation and also, I guess, European regulation? Does that also apply?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on where your services are being delivered to.
Yeah.
But most regulations have their counterpart in the UK and Europe, and more broadly. A great example of one that starts in just a few months is the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA. That kicks off in earnest in January. That's quite ground shaking in terms of what it's looking to do. It's looking to put control and compliance across the whole supply chain for financial services. We'll get onto that in more detail later, I'm sure. But the UK will have, I'm quite certain, what it's going to be called, I'm not sure, its own version of that, an Operational Resilience Act that will be coming out at some point, no doubt in 2025. And I can imagine we'll start to see the first waves of regulation around AI very, very shortly behind that. So, I think the regulator has a huge amount of work to do to stay at the forefront of that and think about how we control and stabilize a growing in complexity financial system. And then the FS companies, those institutions, need to adopt and comply with those regulations. Is becoming a really complicated landscape.
Yeah. So what I took from that is that actually a lot of the challenges stem from the rate of change in technology. So how can technology also be a part of the solution?
Well, ultimately, I think it needs to be.
Yeah.
If you are trying to solve for all of these problems manually, and you've got a growing organizational complexity, it becomes very unscalable quite quickly. So how do companies use some of that technology that's driving them to deliver innovation and new products and services? How do you start to use that to deal with that complexity you have in terms of your conduct, your compliance, your control, to give your customers the right service, but also to maintain the stability of your products and your operation? So that's the key question. How do you use some of those technologies that are driving the complexity to help to solve the problem?
As Aiimi, what we believe is that kind of information governance should be automated where possible. You talk about the number of changes with regards to regulation, keeping on top of that, and that comes with a whole host of challenges in terms of policy documents, and all the documentation that needs to be reviewed and changes and updated. So that's where I naturally lean towards in terms of how tech can actually be part of the solution. Is that similar to what you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. Again, one we talk a lot with about sort of colleagues in the industry and clients. It's never been more difficult to stay compliant, working in compliance in financial services at the moment, right? So you think about that accumulation of policies, practices, controls. Here's a question for you. So how often does a CEO change roles in an FS company?
I'm going to go with 5 years.
It's about every 2.
Okay, well.
Right? Now, how often does a COO change role within an FS company?
I'm going to go in the middle. 3.
It's about 1.5.
Well.
Okay. And you think about all those changes and all of the projects that never quite get finished, all of the organizational changes that never quite get embedded, all of the ways of working evolution, all of the acquisitions that never get completely integrated. It's growing in terms of complexity very, very rapidly. And how do you put your arms around compliance and governance and control across all of that? It becomes a very, very difficult problem to solve.
Yeah, and how do you put your arms around all the various different corporate systems that come as a result of all this change and acquisition, mergers? It's a really good point.
So we need to be looking to technology to help to solve the problem that it's created for us.
Yes.
So humans can't do all that heavy lifting. The cost of compliance has never been higher if you try and do that through traditional means.
How many systems are we talking typically? And I know it's the size that obviously determines the answer to the question. But we would traditionally go out and say a enterprise would have between 300 and 500 corporate systems. I don't think we're far off. Sometimes there could be more. But how the customers you are partnering with and supporting, what does that look like?
So typically any fairly big organization will have a number of ERPs, a number of financial systems. And when it comes to SaaS, that's the big one for me, right? So core systems is one, software as a service, and outsourced services another. How many bits of SaaS do you think you are using in your company today?
Many, 30, 40.
Typically, when we go through this exercise with clients, you can normally add at least 1 0 to the end of that.
That's incredible.
To truly understand the complexity of your IT
That's
landscape,
incredible.
right? So we haven't touched on it yet, but it's a good time to do it.
Yeah.
If we think about supply chain complexity and we think about how teams work today, so we've come from an environment where software was built and delivered and systems were configured and evolved and constructed in a very traditional waterfall method that's tightly governed, that has a gated process and was controlled. It may have been slow and unwieldy at times, but it was controlled. Where we are today, with the adoption of Agile over the last 15 years, a movement to DevOps and now to DevSecOps, that's changed the world quite a lot, right? And you think about delegation of accountability and authority down to those teams that has been given, it's become decentralized. So teams are often given the ability to choose their own tools, their own services, how they work. So the complexity in an organization's grown massively.
Yeah, so you talk about actually gaining control, whereas actually what's happened as a result of incorporating these teams is that it's divested control.
It has. So understanding your supply chain, when those teams can choose their own technology, can choose to take tools and services that are provided by third parties,
Sure.
it becomes very, very complex. So the tool chains they're using, the services they're relying on, how do you as an organization really understand your full supply chain complexity end to end and what you're using and what's outsourced?
Yeah.
So it does become very, very difficult, right? So if you think about the recent challenge that Microsoft and CrowdStrike had,
Yes.
so that's a perfect example
Yes.
of what could be an innocent issue in a tool chain that is critical or important to many, many, many global companies. In fact, I think, it's quoted as the most expensive outage ever.
Yeah.
I think it's cost the Fortune 500 companies over $5 billion just to try and recover from that already.
Yeah.
So, understanding your supply chain, understanding your critical and important services has never been more critical, because actually the mapping of that is very complex now, and we need to find ways to use technology to try and deal with it.
Yeah.
And understand what's critical, what's important to you as an organization, how is it delivered, and how are we going to govern it. So you're looking at a very broad number of tools and technologies across a complex supply chain. And you go back and think about that from the regulator's perspective. What happens when 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 globally important financial services companies are using the same provider?
From your point of view, what data challenges do you see as a result of all this regulatory change that's happening?
I think it's firstly, it's understanding the boundaries of where your data set is.
Yeah.
And understanding what's important and how you're going to govern it, and actually who's running it and owning it and managing it day to day. What I would say, though, G, is that it's not going to get simpler.
No.
Organizations are growing in complexity, they're adopting new technology, they're making acquisitions. So there's no better time than now to get ahead of the problem and try and find ways to help solve that using the right tools and technologies. And acting now is the best point in time to start that process, because the world is becoming more and more complex month by month.
Sure.
And actually going back to some of the regulatory discussions we had earlier, it's interesting that Operational Resilience Act and the UK equivalent is actually going to start to bring a supply chain under the gaze of the regulator.
Yes.
So companies that are providing services and holding data and managing data on behalf of financial institutions are soon going to become regulated if those services are deemed critical or important. There's a big sea change coming, so it's not just the financial services companies that need to think about how they're going to put their arms around their data, secure it, manage it, and leverage the data for their products and services, but also some of the third parties and the service providers and the software providers to those companies. They also need to start to get organized, because they're going to become under the gaze of the regulator and have to get themselves in a position where they can respond to that. So it's a broad question for many people in the supply chain.
Yeah, and it's bigger than FS.
It's a lot bigger than FS. The key point for me is that technology is driving the pace of change by the consumer and by providers looking to leverage that, but that's also driving complexity, and it's happening very, very quickly. Right? We talked about the fact that the purpose of the regulators is to maintain the stability of the financial system, and that puts a lot of pressure and increasingly frequent set of controls on us onto those providers and going forward their supply chains.
Yeah.
So for me, key takeaways are it's only getting more complex. Financial services companies and their suppliers need to act now rather than later, and start to get organized and understand their data and their governance and their compliance and demonstrate control. The next key point for me is that's not scalable with humans doing it as we've traditionally done. We need to start to leverage some of that technology that's driving a lot of this to also solve the problem.
And of course, it's not just financial services that's going to go through this change. It's happening across sectors.
Absolutely. Anywhere where personal identifiable information is used, anywhere where there's critical services that need to remain stable and available, it will apply. So it's not just the regulator that's demanding this. If you want to offer products or services out that are reliable, sustainable, add value, and are available, it's good practice for any company to start to look at that carefully.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Great. Look forward to the next one.
Indeed. Thanks.